For Baron Browning and Jonathan Cooper, it is a contract year, and training camp for the outside linebacker position is one of the bigger pieces we'll focus on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. You can get Locked On Broncos for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So do us a favor, subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports. I cover the team in person daily in Dove Valley, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, a longtime voice for Broncos Country over there at predominantlyorange.com. As their site expert, he brings it round the clock for you. And we're going to break it all down here. Really, Sayre, continuing our training camp position previews. Last week, we focused really on the offensive side of the ball. We're now finally getting to the defensive portion, really kicking things off with the edge rusher position. How many outside linebackers will the team carry on the active roster? Are there two starters that the Broncos have potentially that are in a rotational role right now? And two of the anticipated starters are in contract years, Baron Browning, Jonathan Cooper. That's what we'll kick off today's episode of the show, really talking about. Really for Baron Browning, Jonathan Cooper, two players who play with a significant motor. I think when you look at their play styles a little bit, Jonathan Cooper is athletic. He's burstful. He's fast. He's a really good athlete. Baron Browning, we talk about a guy who's put on so much muscle mass, but has maintained his explosiveness, his athleticism. It's crazy looking at him and saying, okay, hey, I look at his body type, I look at how he plays, and he's fully healthy now coming into training camp. Part of me wonders, can Baron Browning have the biggest year of his career this upcoming season? For both of these guys, they're playing for an extension. Jonathan Cooper obviously played really well last season for the Broncos, led the team in sacks, but now these guys are playing for a contract.
Yeah, and I think, Cody, it's kind of interesting because these two former Ohio State teammates now both rocking their college numbers, maybe some good mojo there for those two guys. But I think you're right. Baron Browning could be in line for his biggest breakout year yet. And I know we've seen some glimpses, like we've talked about, 4.5 sacks in 10 games last year. Certainly nothing to scoff at when we consider the fact that he just changed to the edge position in 2022 and was hurt a lot of that season as well. And it is a matter for Baron of staying healthy. And you're right, he's going into training camp healthy, which I think that's maybe the first time as an edge guy. I can't quite remember 2022 if he was fully healthy then or what, but really this is his first opportunity, in my opinion, to be that guy off the edge for the Broncos. We knew at this time a year ago that the Broncos weren't going to start the season with Baron Browning. He was going to be out for, I don't know, whoever knows how long it was. And we were expecting and anticipating them having to deal with life without Browning. Now we get to dream about what is life going to be like with a fully healthy Baron Browning, and we hope he stays that way going into the regular. We hope every player stays that way going into the regular season. But of course, with a guy like this who is eligible to get extended at any point here now or after the season, he's betting on himself out there. And he, to me, has double-digit sack potential. He's 10 out of 10 on the RAS scale. He's one of the most athletic guys on the team. I feel like he has such a high ceiling that doesn't really get talked about when all these pundits are saying Broncos have a terrible roster, this, that, and the other. I think Baron Browning is one of those guys that tends to get overlooked.
I agree with you there. And look, I want to make mention of this as well, because a lot of people will look at, okay, well, how many sacks do these guys have? And I think sacks are used as the ultimate metric, I think, for most people who observe football. But the reality is you got to look a little bit deeper there. I think my good friend Trey Wingo, who obviously I worked with at Pro Football Network, love Trey, good mentor of mine. Max Crosby, obviously a boogeyman for the Broncos in recent years, recently held a sack summit, the pass rush summit, obviously with Von Miller and all the pass rushers that went there. And look, everyone talks about sacks, but I think one thing he mentioned in there, and Trey echoed this as well on social media, he talked about how important it is for pressures, right? Because when you're pressuring a quarterback, you're creating an uneasy pocket. You're making a quarterback force their decision making or force maybe how they alter their mechanics. And that right there can lead to an interception. It can lead to takeaways. Like it is impactful. And Trey says here, this is why pressures are a better, more productive stat than sacks. If you can get them on the ground, that's great. But make them uncomfortable, and moving them is just as if or not more efficient for a pass rusher or for the defense there. And I couldn't agree more. And when I look at guys like Baron Browning, looking for in 10 games there, he had 10 quarterback pressures, 4.5 sacks, as you mentioned. Jonathan Cooper, 8.5 sacks last season to lead the team, 22 pressures on the quarterback. And hey, we're going to get into Nick Bonitto's as well, because it was also very impressive from that standpoint. I think the Broncos have guys who can create pressure. And I'm very excited to see, does that amplify with them a little bit more now with the additions they made on the defensive line to really strengthen out with the John Franklin Myers coming over at DN? You're going to have Zach Allen there, who is an impactful guy. And then DJ Jones playing the nose tackle position. Then you have your rotational guys behind those guys. Will it make it easier for those guys on the outside edge to generate more pressure? Or if those guys on the outside see more pressure, will allow the interior defensive linemen to generate more pressure or more one-on-ones there? Like it's a balance. It's not going to be a one size fits all. So for me, that's what I'm really excited about. You look at Baron Browning, I think he's got a wide variety of pass rush moves from a finesse standpoint. I think he's got the ability to strong arm some guys as well, especially some bigger tackles in the NFL. And he's got really good sack dances, if we're going to throw that on there. I mean, the guy we talk who looks so much like, you cover his number up, he looks like Von Miller. Not going to look like that now because Barron's hair is longer, I think, right now than it ever has been. So it won't necessarily look like Von Miller from that standpoint. But I remember sharing a clip, I think it was in the 2022 NFL season when they were playing the Indianapolis Colts. You just watched Baron Browning put on an absolute clinic from a pressure standpoint in that. I mean, Brian Baldinger was raving about him as well. I think that Denver, between these two guys, Sayre, I think they have guys that are absolutely worthy of contract extensions. But I also think the guys behind them might make it to where the Broncos decide, hey, we may keep one of these guys. We may not keep any of these guys. We may focus on the future here, which then adds, I think you need more guys behind the guys we're going to talk about here in a minute. And that's obviously where we talk about the Broncos having two potential players that are in their rotation behind Jonathan Cooper and Baron Browning, who are and could be starters in the National Football League. We'll highlight Nick Bonitto and Jonah Elliss coming up here in today's episode. Locked on Broncos. Broncos Country. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And look, FanDuel, they are America's #1 sportsbook, and I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs have winded down, we get fewer games. And the sports, they're not sports in the way that you and I would like them to. But FanDuel lets me keep sports going whenever I want. And all I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And right now is the perfect time to get in on Major League Baseball since it's ongoing right now. But I like doing NFL futures. I like to predict who's going to win every single division this upcoming season. I like to get my futures bets in on NFL MVPs, Rookie of the Year, Coach of the Year candidates. I like to get in that ahead of time to see how things are going to go out. FanDuel lets me get in on the action there. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. Once again, that's FanDuel.com. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
The Denver Broncos may finally have some enviable depth off the edge in the 2024 season. We're going to talk about Nick Bonitto and Jonah Elliss, two key players for this team in 2024 coming in the pass rush department. On today's episode, Locked On Broncos, talking about pass rushers as we ramp up towards training camp, just days away at this point. I mean, we're counting down, Cody, and it's very exciting for Broncos Country. So you know what, Broncos fans, we can't thank you enough for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, wherever you listen to podcasts, free and available on all platforms, as well as on YouTube, where you can watch the show and engage with other members of Broncos Country. And if you haven't done so already, hit subscribe on that podcast platform, hit subscribe on YouTube, and do that, because you know what? We want to get the word out there to every Broncos fan and really walk alongside everyone. This is exciting. It's training camp season. It's football season. We're almost in the swing. And if you haven't done so already, check out Locked On Sports Today. If you're already on YouTube, check out Locked On Sports Today, because you're going to get curated, localized content and coverage for teams that you love from people who cover the team right there in the cities that they're being, covered. So Locked On. Oh, shoot, dude. I just totally flubbed.
No, you're good.
Ad.
No, you're good. You're good.
And if you haven't already, check out Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. That's the best can't miss analysis, news, content coverage, and more from localized experts, bringing you the stuff that you actually want to hear about every single day right here on the Locked On Sports Network, your team every day. Cody, let's talk about Nick Bonitto and Jonah Elliss as well as the rest of this depth here. I know we've struggled in the past with injuries off the edge, guys not being able to fully stay healthy. I even remember going back to Jonathan Cooper's rookie year. Remember, there was the talk about his heart condition and things like that. And injuries are part of the game. We get it, but they've really plagued the Broncos pass rush department, I would say, for the better part of the last 7 years or so. I mean, you talk about multiple season-ending injuries for Bradley Chubb, for Von Miller, and then, of course, the issues that Baron Browning has been facing and things like that. So depth has been tested, and we got to see last year, especially at the start of the year, Nick Bonitto, the former second-round pick, get an opportunity to come out and prove why he was worthy of that second-round distinction.
100%. And I think, look, Nick was probably the one guy that before training camp last year, you and I did a show when we previewed outside linebackers, and we were saying, hey, like the Broncos need to figure out, can Nick Bonitto play at an impact high level, right? There was a reason he was drafted, as high as he was for Denver. He's got a lot of upside to him. His rookie season never went the way that he anticipated. And then he burst onto the scene really in training camp. And I was going to say he was probably my one standout player every single day, because we were sitting there watching, you're taking notes in the team periods. You're like, oh, that would have been a sack for Nick Bonitto. And like when they held joint training camp practices with the LA Rams, he's getting after Matthew Stafford. He's creating problems for that Rams offense there. And I was like, all right, hey, this is a great sign. And you saw him carry that over, obviously, preseason. And then in the regular season, really when he and Jonathan Cooper got a chance to start, I think it was really in that Chicago game, really week 4, even though the defense got off to a rough start in that game. They were a big reason why they ended up winning that. I mean, it starts with the strip sack by Bonitto, the scoop and score by Jonathan Cooper. You talk about needing big plays and big moments. Those two young guys right there showcased exactly that. But here's what's even more impressive about Nick Bonitto. He didn't start as many games for the Broncos last season. He was really in a rotational role. He was the second leading sack producer with 8, right behind Jonathan Cooper by a half sack. But he had 24 pressures in a rotational role, and he led the team in tackles for a loss behind the line of scrimmage with 13. That is huge. That is super impressive. And he looked really good during OTAs and mandatory minicamp, looks more explosive, looks really lean and athletic at the same exact standpoint. There's a lot to be excited about when it comes to Nick Bonitto, but there's also a lot to be excited about with his counterpart in Jonah Elliss, who the team drafted 76th overall, where I think he's going to be a combo hybrid finesse type of player in terms of his rush ability. We called him maybe the cleanup guy for the Broncos defense. I'm excited to see about these two guys right here working with one another this upcoming season.
I am too, because it's two stylistically a couple of different types of players, right? Bonitto is, of course, it's super explosive off the edge. We talked about it when he was drafted, like that 10-yard split is in rare air, rare company. And with Jonah Elliss, it's not that he doesn't have the burst or explosiveness, but he wins in different ways, right? He has a pretty developed, I would say, arsenal of pass rush moves to be able to get to the quarterback. And you saw that at Utah. You saw that his game plan was never reliant on just one aspect. It was never reliant on speed or just strength or things like that. He's able to get to the quarterback a variety of different ways. And so I cannot wait to see him with extended snaps in the preseason, because you just kind of get the impression that he's going to go out there and put on a show a little bit. I mean, that's just what he does when he's given the opportunity. We talked about the motor with guys like Baron Browning and Jonathan Cooper and Nick Bonitto as well. Jonah Elliss shares that quality. I mean, he is going to, these guys are QB hunters. They take pride in not losing a rep, right? And what that means to me is that, like, hey, you get knocked on your butt, they're gonna get up and go after. If the play extends, they're not gonna give up on the play. There's so much of that in Jonah Ellis's game, that you see that relentlessness from him. And I think that makes him an exciting prospect. And like you said, with the cleanup aspect of his game, there's certainly the option that he could come in and be an effective rotational player right away. And we didn't see that necessarily from Nick Bonitto as a rookie. We saw a little bit from Jonathon Cooper, and we saw a little bit from Baron Browning. Remember back in 2021, we're talking about that Dallas Cowboys game for an entire offseason, because we're like, man, these guys have potential. We didn't see it from any of these guys. You can't help but wonder, will that be the case for somebody like Jonah this year? Is he going to have to essentially redshirt? I hope we see him out there on the field in rotation.
I would be shocked if this was at all any point a redshirt year for Jonah. I mean, he's a smart football player. He's so disciplined. I think that's going to be so hard for Jamar Cain, Michael Wilhoit, and Vance Joseph to really ignore here defensively in terms of being creative with it. I mean, this isn't a hot take. I think that Denver's top 4 pass rushers at the edge rusher position are solidified for this upcoming season, which leads to a lot of questions about some of maybe the other guys that are on this roster. Look, you can't just go in with 4. Usually the Broncos will go in with 5 players at the position. We'll highlight that. But, you know, you have Nick Bonitto, Jonah Elliss. You know, we were wondering where Drew Sanders was going to fit into the mix, really. But obviously he's going to be expected to return maybe late into the season. There might even be a chance the Broncos don't bring him back this season to allow him to fully recover from that Achilles injury. Because last year it was really Nick Bonitto and Drew Sanders in that rotation. Now Jonah Ellis's arrival, I think, will be something to keep an eye on. But the one thing I'll say about Jonah, he's not fooled by a lot of things. He plays technique. He plays disciplined off the edge. He was disruptive against several screen passes the Broncos tried to throw during OTAs and minicamp, and he blew up a couple of runs that were trying to go to the outside there. Like, he is a guy that I absolutely have my eyes on here in the offseason portion as we begin training camp here in just about a week and a half, 2 weeks time. Broncos Country can obviously attend on the 26th of July, but rookies will report on the 17th. Veterans report on the 23rd here. A lot to be excited about here. But who are some of the other names at the position behind those guys? I mean, Sayre, I think you look at Thomas Incoom, who made the 53-man roster last year. I think Denver was in a position where their depth last year necessarily wasn't the greatest, right? I know if they brought in Frank Clark, they had Randy Gregory, but then Barron had the injury, and they were like, all right, the reason they brought in Frank Clark was because of Barron's injury. You had questions, can Nick Bonitto step up? And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, somebody else will have to step up at pass rusher because Denver simply just doesn't have the numbers there. And that's what allowed Thomas Incoom to make the 53-man roster. There's veteran Ronnie Perkins, who's listed as an outside linebacker, undrafted rookie free agent Jalen Allen, and then obviously Dondre Tillman out of the UFL, which, look, he's listed as an outside linebacker on the team's website. I think you and I are kind of a little bit more in agreement. So he's going to probably be a defensive end here at the NFL level. We're not going to know this until training camp, but he's going to factor into it as well if he doesn't change positions, if he doesn't go to defensive end, if he stays as a designated outside linebacker. I mean, Denver's top 4, and then you factor in these 4 guys competing. I think Denver will probably keep 5 guys at this spot, which we'll obviously talk about later. But your thoughts here quickly on really these 4 other guys that are here on the roster.
It's going to be a battle in training camp, right? And in the preseason to see these guys, whoever's going to go out and put together the most consistency. I'll be fascinated to find out, is Dondre Tillman going to be asked to lose weight? If he's asked to drop some weight, because he's listed at 270, that's a hefty outside linebacker. I don't know how many teams keep linebackers that size anymore. Maybe when I was growing up in the 2000s, the late 90s,
the old 4-3 defense.
Yeah, that was more so where they were at back then. But you know what? I think if he drops weight, maybe that is the plan for him to play that pressure position off the edge. So we'll see. But I don't mind the depth the Broncos have now. I was really excited to see them pick up Ronnie Perkins last year because he's a former 3rd rounder. So it's kind of cool to see them take a shot on that talent. It's going to be fun to see who makes up this roster and whether or not the Broncos actually end up keeping 5 guys, because I feel like they have the ability to do so with the players currently on the 90-man roster.
And there's also maybe Darrell Chami. We'll throw his name into the mix. He's kind of listed as linebacker, which he could play some inside, could play some outside. Right now, his role is kind of unknown here for the Broncos. It was a late addition to the practice squad last season. We'll see how that kind of plays out here in training camp. But look, Broncos country, we always ask the question as we get ready to predict the 53-man roster, we always look at position by position. How many outside linebackers will the Broncos keep on the roster going into 2024? We'll break that down here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. How many outside linebackers will the Broncos keep on their active roster going into the regular season? We'll predict it based on how we think training camp will go, how preseason will go, and you get that here on Locked On Broncos every single day. We want to say thank you so much to all the everydayers out there in Broncos country who make us their first listen of the day every single day. If you're listening on Mondays and Tuesdays, but not Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, step your game up here, Broncos country, because there's a lot going on with this team. And we have you covered legitimately every single day, all year long, with fresh, objective Broncos coverage that you can't get anywhere else. So make sure you bump that up to 5 times per week because we never leave you going without an episode of the show. Sayre, the interesting conversation here when we talk about the outside linebacker position is how many players they usually keep here. I mean, historically, the last handful of years, Denver's kind of gone with 5 players at that position for the most part. You can maybe factor in if a guy can play outside linebacker and also defensive end. Well, maybe they keep an extra defensive end at one position. Like the numbers game fluctuates here. I mean, you and I think are pretty much in agreement here. We talked about it really in the first 2 segments of the show. Denver's top 4 pass rushers are really kind of solidified at this position with Jonathan Cooper, Baron Browning, Nick Bonitto, and Jonah Elliss. Like those are guarantees. So let's operate on the assumption if Denver goes with 5 players, who do you have as that 5th outside linebacker, or do you have them carrying more than 5?
Well, I like Dondre Tillman as the 5th guy right now, and I know that there's a bit of recency bias there. Certainly, he's the newest Bronco on the roster, right? But I like the versatility and the potential that he could float to the defensive end position or kind of play wherever. We saw when we were watching some UFL highlights of his that he kind of lined up all over the defensive front for the Stallions there. And that was fascinating. And it was really that adds a wrinkle and a layer to his game that could end up, paying dividends for the Broncos if they keep him. They signed him to a 3-year deal. Remember, that's I mean, virtually unprecedented as far as you and I can remember when we were talking about the signing originally. It's hard to think about any players coming up from semi-pro leagues or other professional leagues or wherever, even Canada, whatever. I mean, usually those guys get 1-year flyer contracts. Yeah. And this guy got a 3-year contract from the Broncos. So it wasn't like it was loaded with guaranteed money or anything like that. But certainly when you talk about a player who had 3 straight years of high productivity off the edge and rushing the passer from a variety of alignments at a professional level, that adds intrigue to this guy. And I think he is going to have to come in like an undrafted player and earn every single snap that he gets, every single rep. He's going to have to make his way on special teams. I don't think he's going to be handed a spot in the top 3 or 4 of the rotation by any means. But I do find it interesting that they gave him that 3-year contract, and I like the versatility off the edge. So I'm saying Dondre Tillman as my 5th guy, and I agree with you, Cody. I think it's 5 for me right now.
5 guys is the theme. Really good burgers, by the way, if we're getting a little off topic on today's show here. I've got them keeping 5 players as well, but I'm going to go a little bit opposite of that. I'm factoring in that, like in my perception of this, we'll obviously get to the defensive line where I think Tillman is going to move to defensive end. So I didn't necessarily qualify him in this. So I have it being 5 players. We already talked about Baron Browning, Jonathan Cooper, Bonitto, Jonah Elliss. I got them keeping Ronnie Perkins, who's a veteran guy who, look, I think can play quality football, can slide at the outside linebacker position or play some defensive end for you as well. I've got them keeping him at that position, and then I've got them keeping Tillman as a defensive end guy behind John Franklin Myers and Zach Allen. Spoiler alert, a little bit of flash forward to the defensive line episode that we'll do here later on this week here on Locked On Broncos. But, I agree with you there. I think that Denver has to come to terms with certain things, right? Because obviously we highlighted the importance of this being a contract year for Baron Browning, Jonathan Cooper, okay? And we don't know what decision. We don't know where the thought process is currently right now from the Broncos front office on terms of extending those guys. We know they drafted Nick Bonitto to be a potential future starter or a guy who can emerge for them. I mean, Nick has all the starter potential. Jonah Elliss being drafted 76 overall has the signs of him being a potential future starter here for the team. So what does that really mean? And you and I think are in agreement. Like, you need pass rush in waves. It can't just come from your outside linebackers. It has to come from your defensive tackles, your D ends. But your outside linebackers in today's NFL have to be consistent off the edge, have to be able to generate sacks, pressures, TFLs, maintain edge discipline in order to have success defensively in today's NFL. With the way that we're seeing offenses really try to exploit what defenses do, I think the Broncos struggled in a big time last year at the edge at times with consistency against teams like Miami, teams like the Detroit Lions. Chicago at times got outside of them. Like, that is where Denver has to be better. Is that a scheme or a philosophy issue defensively, or is it a personnel issue? I don't think it's really personnel. I think it's more so related to scheme, but I also think it's situational. Like, do you have the right guys on the field in some of those situations where they're splitting you out wide and just gashing you or kicking you out and allowing guys to fill inside that C gap? Like, that's where I have so many questions about this defense. I think it'll look different from what I've seen so far at OTAs and minicamp. It's hard to really gauge without the pads, but the pads are going to come on. I do think that Denver's defensive philosophy will be a little bit different this year, but I think it'll be more aggressive. And I think these guys all factor into the rotation, the mix there. And then part of me also wonders, like, if Drew Sanders does come back this year, what does that mean for that other outside linebacker spot? Or does he go back to inside linebacker? These are some questions we don't necessarily have the answers to right away.
Yeah, I can't wait to discuss that inside linebacker position and really get in depth on Drew Sanders a little bit more, because I think that's where he is more of a factor in the future. So we will get to that, I think. But Cody, for me, it really goes back to something Alex Singleton said back at OTAs and minicamp when he was talking about how, they don't have to all learn a new scheme this year. I mean, they may be changing the scheme a little bit, but they don't have to sit. They're not sitting there and starting with a new coordinator, new verbiage, new terminology, new this, new that. And he talked about the comfort level of being able to do that and going into a second year in the same defense and how much of an advantage that is. I can't help but wonder, how big is that going to be for these edge guys too? Because last year it did feel like they were kind of, just trying to get their heads above water, so to speak. Like, the talent has always been there with Cooper, Browning, Bonitto. Those guys have never lacked talent. They've never lacked athleticism. They've never lacked strength. They've never lacked hustle, effort. It's now all about the game slowing down for these guys. And I know that can kind of sometimes be an overused term, but I think it really applies for this edge position group, right? It's the game slowing down for these players and really being able to play smart. We saw that from Von Miller, where from a young age, as a rookie, Von was able to play smart and dominate, whether it was run or pass. He could blow plays up no matter what. You get a little over aggressive at times, but I think that was kind of part of the problem last year for this edge group, wasn't it? Was they were just pinning their ears back and like, all right, well, if I'm not going to win as a pass rusher, I'm going to lose this rep. If I'm not going to win with speed to the outside, I'm going to lose this rep. And then you would see running backs just kind of scoot right inside their arc, their pass rush arc. So it was a lot of a guessing game, I felt like, last year from this edge position group. Now this year, the game slowing down for these guys. I feel like they're all primed to, like, this, it's bubbling over right now, and the water's boiling, and it's time for these guys to really prove that they are second contract players, which I think every single one of them, the top three, I think they all are.
I agree with you 100%. And look, I think that there's going to be a drastic difference this year, because I do think the Broncos defensive line right now, at least on paper, with the projections that you and I maybe have in our head, which we're not going to share right away, we'll get that later on this week in Locked On Broncos. I think it'll be the best defensive line group the Broncos have had in the last 5 or 6 years. And I'm excited to see how that opens things up for these guys on the outside end. But Broncos Country, look, we're looking for your input. We're looking for your feedback when it comes to outside linebackers. How many players at outside linebacker do you think the Broncos will keep? And if so, who is it? Make sure you let us know if you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening wherever you get your podcast. But for all you everydayers out there in Broncos Country, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of the show. We're going to take a look at the Broncos defensive line. Yes, we think it's significantly better than it has been in years. What does the depth look like there? Who makes the 53-man roster? Our training camp preview on the defensive line comes to the forefront on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.